Delighted to have this session about the pretty unprecedented thing that is 800 words. We have got Kelly Martin and Maxine Fleming and James Griffin, and Irene Gardiner is going to chair tonight, and she's going to introduce them to you. So I'm going to hand you over to Irene, who herself has had rather a long career in New Zealand television, and right back when she led the production unit at TVNZ, and she became a commissioning editor at TVNZ and a head of commissioning at TVNZ. She's been a journalist, and she's now the content director at the wonderful New Zealand On Screen. So thank you so much, Irene. So glad to have you guys with us, and I'll now hand over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, and welcome everyone. I'm also a huge fan of 800 words, which I think might be why I got chosen to do this tonight. I need to put my glasses on to... So we're going to kind of, obviously the session is about 800 words, but it's also with the focus of thinking about working with Australia, what we have to offer. So we're going to kind of explore some of those themes. But just to give you a bit of background on 800 words, last year, nearly 2 million Australians tuned in each week to watch the show. It's the first of its kind, a TV drama series created and shot in New Zealand for an Australian network. A co-production between NZ's South Pacific Pictures and Australia's Seven Productions. The show was commissioned for primetime on the Seven network, where it shot to #1 viewing for Australian households. The first season has just picked up 4 Logie nominations, including Most Outstanding Drama Series, and the second series is now in production. With us tonight, as Esther said, we have the show's creators and writers, James Griffin and Maxine Fleming, and we also have South Pacific Pictures CEO, Kelly Martin. Before we start with James, Maxine and Kelly, let's have a look at the trailer for the show. So that's 800 words, trailer. Now, we're going to have a sort of a loose format that, I'll take these guys through the evolution of the show, and then we will have questions at the end, so get some great questions in mind as we go along. To get us started, we're just going to talk about the conception of the show, what was learnt through the commissioning, writing and production process, and obviously the experience of making a show for one of Australia's biggest networks. And to get us started, because James kind of was the one who had perhaps the very first kernel of the idea, you start.
Okay, I will, Irene, thank you. Every now and then at SPP we have these meetings of writers, and South Pacific Pictures tells us what they think broadcasters here and overseas are looking for, and we jot down, TV2, hot crime drama, whatever, on our pieces of paper and go away and think about it. We had one of these meetings, and they thought that TV1 was looking for a family-oriented drama, that it was time to go back to this. So I went away with that in my head, and then I went on holiday with my family, and we were doing a tiki tour around the middle of the North Island, Waitomo, places like that, and we washed up in Raglan, and we spent a few days in Raglan, and I fell in love. I'd never been to Raglan before. I fell in love with the place, and it kind of, a whole bunch of things that I've been thinking about middle-aged men taking up surfing and all those kind of tragic things, coalesced into this thing. And I thought, I'd always wanted to do an epic life change drama comedy series, because having worked on Messy Peak, I'd kind of loved the genre, and shows that I'd watched I loved, and I thought I always wanted to do one of those. So while we were there, I started writing down a whole bunch of notes, and then I went to Maxine, and I took the notes to Maxine and said, "What do you reckon? Is there a series here?" And together we then kind of created the world of the town of Weld, the family of the Turners who shift there, and at that point in time, they shifted from Auckland to to weld this
Because at
fictional
that
town.
point in time, we were still talking about a New Zealand
We were still
network.
talking about a New Zealand show. So there were, Max and I then duly wrote our proposal documents, took them to SPP, and put them into the system. And that's kind
And-
of the genesis of it.
Obviously, 800 words, a columnist. You at that time were a columnist.
Yeah, I've always I'd written a column for Canvas, or up until recently. The pain still, the hurt is still,
It's all right,
still
James.
real. At the time, I was writing a column for Canvas, which was
Was it 800 words?
Which was 800 words. That's what it was meant to be, and I had come to like the fact that I tried to make each column exactly 800 words, like George does in the show. And I like the idea. I'm one of the devices that I like in a show is having a narrator. And I'd never really, we actually tried to get a narrator into Outrageous Fortune right at the beginning, but that fell by the way. And I've always wanted to have a narrator. And so I thought George writing his column could, tell us about the life of the town and his inner life. And so I used that as a framing device, yeah.
And I remember in terms of bringing Maxine in, I remember you telling me some time ago that because Maxine had been through grief, losing a husband and dad, and that's a big thing in 800 words, that was hugely helpful. Do you mind, are you comfortable talking about that, Maxine?
I am. Yes, of course. I think that's a huge... Oh, I've got to hold it right up here. Hello, everybody. I may break into song if I'm,
Go for it.
When James brought the idea to me, it really resonated with me for a number of reasons. And first and foremost, before, quite apart from the idea, I just really was welcoming the thought of working with this fine gentleman again. I don't think we'd worked together for ages.
No, it'd have been too long. That was part of the attraction.
Since that other little show you did called Outrageous Fortune, possibly.
Yeah, tiny.
Yeah, that little thing. And but the idea really resonated with me for personal reasons, of course. And some of them were to do with the fact that, yes, I had been through those kind of experiences with my teenagers, and their father died, yes, and when they were similar ages to Shay and Arlo, who are our fine actors are in the audience out there tonight, by the way. Thank you for coming, children. And so that really resonated with me, and I felt like I could, bring my truth, I suppose, to the story. For sure. And I loved, I guess it was the fantasy version though of grieving that appealed to me. I certainly wanted to sell up and go and move to a small coastal town after my children's father died. I didn't. I did sell up my house in Green Bay and move back into town, however. So I guess that was kind of similar. I did it very quickly as well. And was possibly quite mad at the time that I was. So a lot of things resonated with me about the idea that it does deal with grief, about a family, and the idea of a family circling their wagons and trying to find, a new place in the world.
And you've actually both got teenagers, haven't you? So there's a level of writing about
Indeed.
something you
and
know.
Yes, I'd say that there are, and as we developed and talked about who those children might be, I would say that the fact that those children happen to be both the similar sexes and ages to ours is not entirely a coincidence. And but they're the similarities ends. So there was definitely that.
So we've got some good mix of thoughts. We've got a kind of we've got a genesis of a series here, but at this stage we are still talking about making this in New Zealand. And so now we're going to hand over to Kelly, who's going to tell the incredibly long, involved story, because it actually took as much as 2 years to get from this to happening, and somehow we moved from New Zealand to Australia.
Okay, I can tell that story. It was actually, when I first got to SPP, this idea was already on the table. And the idea was for it to be developed for TVNZ. And TVNZ had committed to developing the series. And we had gone to New Zealand On Air and got development money. And then you did work on scripts and storylines, and the idea of Eric Thompson came up, and we wanted Eric to be the lead. But Eric had a deal with Channel 7 in Australia, so that was slightly problematic. But we kind of had conversations, and Eric got involved quite early, and he loved the show. So just stop me if I get anything wrong here, James, because I'm going... Oh.
No, you're doing great.
Thanks.
Carry on.
Okay, so I've got
Forge
this.
on.
Yeah, forge ahead. So yes, it is kind of complicated, but TVNZ only wanted the show if Eric was in it. Channel 7 wouldn't let Eric go and do the show because Eric had commitments in Australia, because once Pack to the Rafters finished, they were trying to find something for Eric, another vehicle for Eric. And they had a couple of things that they were working on, and they had one that was reasonably advanced. And so we talked to them about a possible co-production between TVNZ and Channel 7. That was one of the first conversations that I had with Australia. And that was always going to be a... Can you say clusterfuck on stage? I mean, it was.
Yes, you can say clusterfuck.
Thank
It's
you.
a comedy bar, for fuck's sake.
It was always going to be difficult, but it was on the table. It was a suggestion. And then basically it ended up with us going to TVNZ and going, we don't think we can get Eric, but this can still be a great series. And there was a whole raft of other great New Zealand actors who could have filled that role. And so then TVNZ, they had a few other little irons in the fire, as it turned out. And they kind of went, no, we don't want it anymore. So we were kind of a long way down the road in developing the series, and they sort of got cold feet, or they changed their minds. And they, at that time, they had finally played Broadchurch. Is anyone from TVNZ here? Bad. But they'd had Broadchurch for a while, and they had played Broadchurch, and Broadchurch had rated through the roof 2 years on, and so they were thinking, no, we need darker, we need darker, we need more interesting than a family kind of comedy drama. So they said no. So went back to Australia, and we kind of went, well, what if we made it for Channel 7? So, and the Australians they're not big on New Zealand production companies making shows for them, and they certainly didn't rush. What they wanted to do was basically buy the idea off us. It was kind of like, well, it's a great idea, we love the idea, can we have it? Could you sell it to us? And we were no, because we want to make it. And one of my favourite ones was the head of production at Channel 7 saying to me, why does it have to be in New Zealand though? Why can't they just go to a smaller... I don't understand why you want to do it in New Zealand. And I went, because we're New Zealanders. And we want to make it where we live, and we want to make it. So that kind of went back and forth quite a lot. And with long pauses in between drinks, I would see them at a market and go, so, hey, 800 words, and we still love the idea, but they also had the other show that they were making with Eric, and they wanted to put that on the telly and see how it went. So finally that went to air, and it did very averagely. And at the same time, what happened was that the New Zealand government brought the grant in, the, what's it called? Special Patrol Group, I always want to call it, but it's the Screen Production Incentive Grant. I should know the name of it properly since we've utilised it very well. So yes, that happened, and we in the office had the kind of genius idea, oh shit, we could actually go to the Australians and say, let's do this as a co-production, we can make it in New Zealand, and essentially we can bring 40% of the budget. So all of a sudden, they had an idea on the table that not only did they love the idea, but economically it was about to make a whole lot more sense to them. And so they came on board in that way. And TVNZ then just sort of did a deal to buy the show as a finished product. So their creative input had stopped quite a long way before, and they just bought it and played it. And yeah, so I mean, I have to give credit to the Australians, because the whole way down the road, it was a huge leap of faith for them to get a New Zealand company making the show. And I think a lot of people are probably thinking, oh, they did it because they got it cheap. And they didn't. They didn't get it cheap. Australian investment is good, but by the same token, we're probably making it for about the same sort of money as what we would have made a New Zealand production in New Zealand for. So there wasn't a huge... but in Australia, there's no such thing as New Zealand On Air, so they would have been paying 100% of the costs. Yeah,
but the Screen Production Incentive Grant, have I got it right? Yes. That was quite crucial turning point, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, because of the money. It just made economic sense.
And so were you the first production to do
I
that?
think we were.
To
I think we were.
utilise that?
And 800, I mean, that the Film Commission are incredibly busy with that grant now, and there's a whole heap of people taking projects in there all the time. I talked to Dave Gibson about this the other day, and it is working spectacularly well across many different genres, and lots of people are getting in there. 800 words, though, it's kind of like a postcard perfect version of that, because it's set in New Zealand, it's written by New Zealanders, all of the crew were New Zealanders. We had a decent chunk of Australian cast, but also a lot of, the bulk of them were New Zealanders, but it was for an Australian network. So when it came to the points system about whether we qualified, we knocked it out of the park. We qualified ridiculously because it was, yeah.
And so would that period of time from James, in effect, having the first twinkle of the original idea through to finally, yes, tick, we're doing this, was that about 2 years?
Yeah, it was. It would have been.
Wow.
Yeah.
And do you think, I mean, obviously the SPIG contributed,
Call it
Production
that.
and Centre Build, and I presume Eric's he
Yep.
had an interest and a support
Eric
that contributed?
was a big driver too, because he loved the project, and so he was talking to his people in the Australian network, and they're very committed to him. So the fact that he was there saying, I really like this, and these guys can do it.
All through this, Eric and I had a kind of a Facebook back channel going, you say this, okay, I'll say that, yeah, okay, fine. We were kind of, it was great fun. I enjoyed that.
Are you saying I'm a puppet?
No, Kelly, you are
She
not
was
a
doing the
puppet.
hard work. And so, and presumably, I mean, it's kind of a confluence of things really, because presumably also had Eric's other show taken off.
Yep.
That
We might not have made it, or we might still be going, hey, how about that show? I probably still would have been saying it, because I think 800 Words is one of those shows you read. I'd read a couple of scripts, and the characters come alive for you. And then, I remember saying to you once, James, and you might not remember this, but I kept saying, I said, they just keep coming back to my brain. Yeah, but they did. The characters just kept coming back into my brain. I kept thinking, we have to make this because it's such a great story.
But that sort of touches on another important thing, you saying I wouldn't have given up, I would have just kept, and presumably...
That's probably not true, I probably would have given up.
But presumably your existing
I'm a quitter.
relationships...
Gone right off us.
Your existing relationships with Australian network folk that you presumably had already to some degree?
I am actually a network person. That is the truth of the matter.
Well, you have a background in that.
That is my background, is entirely being a network person. I just am still struggling with this whole idea that I'm
Not.
But
those relationships presumably helped you.
Can I just throw in here on behalf of the writers that there was also there is, silently, not too loud, there are a bunch of people in quite powerful positions in Australian television who quite like the stuff that we make. They look at Outrageous Fortune and the Almighty Johnsons and shows like that and go, they're actually really quite good. We can't do them here, or we could do a version of them in some cases.
Didn't someone particularly have a thing about Almighty Johnsons, didn't you?
Yeah, one of the, Eric worked on one of the guys who is the, head honcho of Seven, who really liked the Almighty Johnsons, just had a kind of a thing for it.
Is that Tim Warner?
It may very well have been. That name rings a bell, because I have terrible memory, as you've just pointed out.
All right, so keeping things moving along. So we've got the tick. Yep. So now we're going to go into production. Now, it's quite different. You're used to working with New Zealand networks, New Zealand funder. Everything is suddenly different. You're not used to them. They're not used to you.
That was less of an issue for me, personally, than it was, because, referring back to earlier comment about I am essentially a network person, and in all my years at TV3 and TVNZ before that, I knew all of the Australian network people, and I had dealt with them, and I'd been at screenings with them, and so I knew what they were like. And the difference between Australia and New Zealand in terms of, it's kind of grown up, and we aren't really. I think,
More mature.
yeah, but everything's bigger, everything is just more serious. The money's, always the money's big, it just all matters to them a whole lot more. They take it all incredibly seriously. And I mean, I can remember having conversations. I was at TV3, I was the director of programming, and I was commissioning shows, and this is not about me, but, commissioning shows, buying shows, doing all of that. And I would meet my counterparts at Australian networks, and honestly, they were so freaking important, like off the scale. And I was thinking, no, but we're doing the same job. I think we're doing the same job. And it's a little bit like that with this, where they just take it all a lot more seriously.
So how did you writer folk find it? Who'd like to go first?
Look, there was, and I do have to say, it still is a learning curve, even through the second series. On one hand, you have a production company that has successfully made many, many hours of really good drama in this country, drama that's sold all around the world. And I'm not just talking about the stuff that I do, but all the writers of SPP, all those kind of things. On the other hand, you have a network that until this moment, and this is kind of a crucial point, they had never commissioned anything outside of them.
Wow.
We're talking about producing.
They were like, I was thinking today that they were like TVNZ of old, but when I started working for TVNZ, they had an in-house drama department. They made this, we made the stuff, we put it out. And so for them to not only commission something out of the house, to commission it across the Tasman was mega. It was huge.
Risk.
And so when you've got a situation that big, they're really nervous.
Yeah.
And
They were.
And we, no matter how much we go, sure, just fucking chill.
We got this. We got this. Don't worry,
bro. Because look, track record. We're quite good. We make good shit.
That was an ongoing
somehow
conversation.
that didn't fly with them.
No.
So there was a learning curve.
There were
still is.
Yeah, there were a lot of times in the building and across all levels, our legal team, the finance team, and down into cast crew, where people would be going, well, why are they so worried about this? Why are they? No, TVNZ have never asked us to do this or this or this. And we kept having to say, well, because this is a massive risk for them, and they don't know us. They've got no, they know who we are and all the rest of it, but they'd never worked with us, so that trust wasn't there. If SPP's making a show for TV3 or Prime or TVNZ, there's a level of trust that's already established. And so, if things get a little bit hairy or the schedule isn't going exactly according to the hour, to the minute, to the day, it's not the end of the world, because they know we will deliver. But the Australians, they didn't have that comfort, so they were a lot more nervous.
And that is entirely understandable, actually.
It is entirely
'cause
understandable.
It was a whole new
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, I think that's what we kind of came to realise is just as we went along, was just what a risk it was for them. And so, I now understand that. I personally didn't really get that at the time. I think they really had, and they never have got quite used to our sort of more organic way of working.
Organic is a creative word for not keeping to a schedule. That's what that is.
Let's be honest here.
And nothing's going to change, really, in that way. So I guess that will be an ongoing friction forevermore. However,
They might just trust you a tiny bit more in series 2.
I think
It's got better, but it's still, there's elements of it still. Yeah, for sure.
But aside from that thing of forging a relationship with people you haven't worked with, which obviously is huge, there were also little kind of cultural differences in terms of the way you wrote the series, little issues that you would strike along the way. Maybe more conservative, perhaps, the Australian...
Shall I start on this subject? But
Go on, Maxine. Go leap into it.
Yeah, well,
The way sex was handled on the show.
I think James probably could speak to that better in a way, because he was
Because he's a man?
No, because he was the showrunner. But certainly they were more conservative, and it was tricky because look, we're telling a story of a man who has many attractive women circling around him, and we're trying to explore those stories. It seemed they wanted us to go a lot slower than we're used to, shall we say. Would that be true, James?
Yeah, it should probably explain that one of the points of difference that Maxine and I when you're doing the genre of life-changing TV, you generally have person moves from A to B, B being much smaller than A. There is someone there that they immediately form some kind of chemistry with, and then you spend 5 series not getting them together. And I thought, screw that.
No.
And I went to Max, well, let's create a whole bunch of strong women characters who may or may not be the person for George, because, the guy's died, when's he going to restart his life? Finding a new partner as part of that. And trying to get that kind of, those dynamics across to the Australians was kind of interesting.
That's right, and still is.
And still is.
I wish that I could have brought the email that we wrote to them about the fact that George is a man. And we want him to be manly. He is in his, late 30s, according to him, in his 40s. And we literally wrote an email.
George gets younger every series. We've decided this.
I did write an email.
He was 42 last series. He's 39 this series, okay?
But it was basically the whole email was kind of going, we don't want him to be a softcock. He's a man in his mid-40s who's single, and the idea that he wouldn't do anything physical just makes him we thought made him a tiny bit sad.
And it surprised me. It did, how conservative Australian network television is, or the Channel 7 version is. And
but
that's not a bad thing. That gives you stuff to work with.
And then there's a little further complication to that with series 2, isn't there? In that because the audience was so broad when the first one screened, and kids ended up watching it. They're now going to probably.
It's a blessing and a curse that it is.
We kind of got a bit hoisted on our own petard, as it were, by the success of the show, because they kept saying, originally, close your ears, Melina and Benson, they were really worried about the presence of teenage kids in the series, because they didn't want it to be kind of one of those little family drama things, where the teenage. So they kept cutting back on the teen stories. And
they also wanted it to be all about George.
And it was all about George. And then when lots of families watched the thing, according to their research and their belief. Now they love the teens. You're cool, you guys. And we added a whole new audience. But because it's now gone from being an adult show to a family show, there are certain words that we could use in the first series that we can't use now. It's finding its ground as a series, which is.
I won't ask you for the list of words. I won't ask you for the list of words.
Irene, you've used them all. You know them all.
I do work in television.
The other differences that we were touching on the other day were also, I guess, things like we are probably, generally, as New Zealanders, a lot less politically correct when it comes to racial stuff, Māori, New Zealand, interrelations. We are used to being more irreverent about it these days, and that was another thing that we came up against, wasn't it, James? That they didn't find that stuff so funny.
There was a story about Maori protesters that they just freaked out about and totally did not get, and went, you can't do this, and we had to tone it into something else.
Yeah, so there's those kind of things.
But to be fair, they know their audience as well, don't they? So that was that whole thing about it.
Learning process. Learning process.
And the theme of tonight is that thing of working for Australia. So what do you do? What do you adapt to? How do you make that work?
You're learning their parameters.
How do you deal with the fact that they think your sand is ugly?
We took them out west. I have to tell this one. We took the network exec from Australia. She came over to have a look at where we were going to shoot, our beautiful west coast. And Eric and I and me and Chris Bailey, I drove out to Muriwai, and we got out there and we were, it's like New Zealand's finest. It's Auckland's best beaches. It's bloody beautiful. And she went, the sand just looks a bit dirty, doesn't it? And you will notice on the posters that the sand is golden. I've never
Yes,
got
check
over
out the
that.
DVD cover. It's Golden Sand.
Yes.
Actually, that is kind of interesting, though, because we did talk about that a lot, the look of the show and how it all came together. And Australians aren't really interested in seeing New Zealand beaches because they've got beautiful beaches. That's not what this was about. And we did learn that that West Coast thing was important, but actually turn it round and look at the greenery. And so you'll notice even the long shots and the panning over beaches and stuff like that, it's more focused on the bush than the beach because that's what's different about New Zealand to an Australian audience.
One of the things you said to me, Maxine, when we were prepping for tonight was, we were talking about that, yes, it wasn't without its challenges along the way, but one of the things that you said as a positive was they know what they want.
Yes, I think that is the other way to put it, and they do, and I respect that. Actually, we respect that most days because you know what you're dealing with, and without dissing anyone else that we've had to deal with, sometimes when the messages you're getting are mixed, shall we say, or possibly even contradictory, it becomes quite difficult to negotiate or even work out what the issues are. So at least they were consistent, I think, and therefore,
I think it's true now is that we are at the point where, when storylines get suggested or things get suggested, we can pretty often get it right in terms of going, they're going to hate this, and you have to pick which ones
battles.
Are not going to be.
I think there's been movement on both parties that
we probably adjusted
they kind of
to
appreciated
them,
that in Australia some of the feedback about the show was that it was different, and they went, okay, well,
Be different.
let's go with that a bit.
Yeah.
So we found a middle ground, pretty much.
Yeah.
It's a bit rocky at times, but that's okay.
And you get through that, and then you get to the bit where you're about to screen. And this is, I think, the bit where I think you would all agree that working with a big network in a big country, maturity of industry, all of that, fantastic promotion of the series.
They threw the kitchen sink at it. They spent a lot of money promoting it. They had a really long lead time in how they promoted it. They didn't just put promos on air. They did off-screen. They did online. They did billboards. They did bloody radio ads. They did newspaper ads. They did everything, the like of which we just don't get to see so much these days. And it worked.
It's that whole mindset of, okay, we're in with the show. We're fucking going to give it heaps, mate.
Yeah.
Commitment.
Fuck it.
This is the best thing you've ever seen.
No, it's it. When we can write it off as Aussie brashness, but fuck, it works.
Yeah, I take my hat off to them.
Yeah, definitely.
It was a real eye-opener to me personally. Like, I think I've always, as a creator, writer, if things I've worked on haven't rated as well as I thought they might or could, I think I've always personally thought that's got to be my fault a little bit, or our fault. And I'm kind of starting to realise that that's not always. It's that they gave it their absolute best shot, and the results were amazing. Like right from the start, there's none of this. Oh, let's put it on and see if people like it, and then it's just really shifted how I think about what we make, and I think there's a lot to be learnt here from the way they do it.
Was some of the reason they pushed it so hard because it was Eric's new vehicle, and that was incredibly important?
Yeah.
He was what they pushed, because he's the point of reference, and that gave them a safe historical background with the Rafters, but that they pushed the colour and the quirkiness and all that kind of stuff as well. But I mean, man, they worked Eric into the ground before it went to air. They were flying him all over the country, talking to anyone who would listen about the damn show.
And
Eric worked harder during the promo than the shoot.
But he was also happy to do it because he knew that it makes a
had the potential,
difference. It really does.
So that's a lesson, in what you can achieve. And so they got a hit show because you guys made a great show and because they promoted it really, really well. So now we're making series 2. How many in series 2? Are we allowed to say? How many episodes?
16 episodes.
So that's twice
Twice the order.
Have you written them all?
Halfway through.
We are shooting episodes 7 and 8 at the moment.
That's not the question
there
I
are
asked, James
all
Griffin.
They're coming. They're coming.
Do you want me to?
Eventually.
Do you want me to spend 20
James
minutes
has to leave now, he's
explaining
got
the
work to
writing
do.
process here, Irene?
No, I
they,
really
are all,
Wednesday.
they are all in some level of writing, okay?
Maybe Thursday.
Thursday. Maxine says Thursday.
After this. Thursday week.
And now it is a bit easier with them, series 2. You sort of said it was.
It's heaps easier. I mean, whereas the discussions in the first series were about core issues, now they're about the periphery. And they're about taste and how we do things. No, they're still not quite used to our kind of ways. But basically, they are on board. They're totally on board now.
So there's always that. In the first series, you're still working out what it is and who the characters are. I mean, although I would have to say that I feel in this show that everything was a lot clearer. I feel quite early on. However, in the second series, you get to build on that the actors know who their characters are. We know the world we're dealing with. The network, the channel knows who they are.
Well, that's an absolute point. I mean, we're casting a whole bunch of people that they don't know.
Yeah.
And they go, can this actor do that? And we go, yeah, fine, we've used them before, they're fine. Or they're funny, they're great. And then they see them and they go, oh, okay,
Hilarious.
that's great. And so now we get to broaden the world.
So casting the New Zealand actors will be easier this time around than the first time around.
What it means for us is that where they were wary of letting story stray away from George, now they're happy for us to give story to other characters, which is that's absolutely as a series should evolve when it's an ensemble cast.
Again, you can see that
location-based
from their
series.
I mean, all the New Zealand actors are great in the series, but you can see that from their point of view. Again, they don't know any of those people.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
they do. They've
I
used
mean,
them all.
Actually, that's true. They do know some of those people.
And my worry is now, having cast a bunch of people who are kind of more used to gracing the stage here, that they're now asking them to act, dramatic stuff instead of just doing comedy shtick. Uh-oh. Jesse Griffin, your time is up. You're going to get a dramatic storyline sooner or later, whether you want it or not.
Right, we're getting fairly near to the time where we should throw over for questions, but let's just talk a little bit about the future for the show, for SPP, and for you as individuals. Will we get a third series? Yes.
It depends if the second series works.
That's an easy answer.
I'd say that's a fairly sure bet, though.
Cut to the chase, Irene. Does this mean anything for New Zealand?
Well, actually, I was going to go more personal than that. I was going to say, have you two had any offers yet
No.
from Australia?
Maxine's now producing Shortland Street.
So she's a bit busy at the moment.
Promoted
And I'm still down in the coal mines doing my stuff.
But you would sort of think that maybe after the second series, or the third, that could perhaps, for New Zealand people like yourselves and for South Pacific Pictures, this must open some doors.
Yeah, I guess. But we talked about this a little bit the other day. I think in terms of taking projects to Australia, I don't think that there's going to be a sudden rush of Australian networks wanting New Zealand production companies to make shows for them. And I think a lot of it is to do with what the content of the shows is. And even with the grant, I think it's valid to say that the projects needs to be kind of story driven. You shouldn't be. I don't think that we should be creating stuff just to access a funding model. That doesn't, that never leads to good stuff. The good thing about this show is that it was a great show to start with. That then the funding model came in.
Because the thing that we kind of skipped over in all this is that when it changed from being a series about a guy moving his family from Auckland to Raglan, and from Sydney to Raglan, it became exponentially more interesting.
Yeah, that's right.
And it brought into to play all these other factors. And so you have to make sure the project has that.
Which
wow
isn't,
factor.
I mean, it does give us the ability. I've had conversations with Australian producers and they don't love us because pulled this off, and so many of them have not really. I've had some funny conversations actually, but one of them in particular said we should not underestimate the enormity of what we achieved by having something go into the Australian market and be as successful as this show was. And they were all kind of lined up waiting to see what would happen, all, arms crossed, leaning back. And I think there was a few shocked people when it did do, even us as well. Actually, when after the first episode had gone to air, the first I knew about how well it had done was that I got a text from the network programmer from Channel 10. Didn't get called from 7. It was like, oh yeah, it was all right. But she went, Jesus, you did over $1 million.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was amazing.
I was in Sydney at the time after having been led astray by bad actors, and I got a phone call in the hotel room, and that was kind of when the network person is calling you in your hotel room at some ungodly hour of the morning, telling you how awesome it was, with a kind of a tone of surprise in her voice.
Yeah, and cut to me at the sitting around in the basement at South Pacific Pictures around the Shortland Street table, getting a phone call from James, to say that it had rated through the roof, and it kind of just didn't quite register really, and it all seemed a bit unreal, really, and it was business as usual, figuring out what Friday's cliffhanger was on Shortland Street. But back to that. But also, just adding to that, I just wanted to say, like, for me, and creatively, I guess I'm not ever interested in, like, packing up my bags and, heading off to Hollywood to pitch my, sell my wares because, or even Sydney, although maybe there's something wrong with me, because it's got to be the idea, as Kelly says, that appeals. For me, it's not about making it big somewhere. It's the idea, the story. If you're going to spend 2, 3, possibly the rest of your life working on a show, you've got to love it. So, yeah.
It is an incredible achievement, though, and I actually felt at the time, I don't think there was enough really in New Zealand media actually recognising what an incredible achievement it was that it had done so well and been.
You don't want to get too big for your boots here. It was all right.
I don't know. It's something I'm trying to figure out why that is. So, having had Outrageous Fortune remade for network television in America and the UK, having had The Almighty Johnson screen on premium cable and
made in Russia
in the US, and the awesome Russian pilot. There's something about fucking conquering that big blob of a country over there was really cool.
Yeah.
It was really cool.
I thought so.
Do you know what the great thing too for me was that James had talked to me quite a while before this, I think when we did the last contract renegotiation before.
It's another one of these things I won't remember.
Yeah. But he had talked about maybe heading over and seeing if he could, what was happening in Australia and whether there might be some stuff going on over there. I remember you talking about that and me kind of going, yeah, no, that'd be okay. So it's quite cool because we've got you doing an Australian show, but you're still here.
And I went to Australia. I didn't go to Australia, but I contacted all the agents over there, and no one gave me the time of day.
Well, you could try again now.
Yeah, they
of
might
course,
now.
if you really wanted to.
Nah, he's good.
Just picking up on the New Zealand thing, one of the things that happened, of course, was because the show was extremely successful, TVNZ got caught a bit short with their purchase of the series that they had evolved into and had to race it on air quite suddenly in the later part of the year because I think they'd planned to put it in the new season. And so the show still did pretty well, but maybe not quite as well as it might have had a bit more push.
Yeah.
I
think that's fair.
Possibly confidential information, but do we know when we might get Series 2 here in New Zealand?
A lot closer to the Australian air date.
So,
No, I mean they are. They're planning on putting it much closer to the Australian air date. Whereas last time they had not planned to use it, and we did sort of have the conversation saying, you probably don't want to sit on this until next year.
Because everyone would have watched it
Quietly
online by
does
then.
speak volumes, doesn't it? Delete that.
Scratch.
Okay, so I have one last question before we hand over to the team. Who's going to the Logies?
Ain't that interesting?
I offered James and Chris Bailey, and neither of them wanted to. So
What are you wearing? I'm kidding.
Dolce & Gabbana.
No, Karen Walker or something local. Represent.
Yeah, because everybody's going to be looking at me.
It'll probably come out in these folks' questions, but anything we left out? Anything last things you want to throw in?
Quick, James. Think of
Oh, no, these guys will ask.
Questions. Go to questions.
Hello, lovely audience. Would anyone like to ask our panel a question? Yes, please.
Maxine, you touched on
Oh, God. Yes.
writing organically. Can you talk about that a bit more? Is that good or why is it good?
Yeah, I'm well, writing organically. I meant, I actually I was referring to delivering scripts organically. You know, they take the time that they take, is what I was meaning there.
And the Australians were quite hit this point now.
Yeah, that's what I meant there. Gosh, if you want me to talk about how I write, that's another whole, thing.
That's next month's session.
Yeah.
In depth with Maxine.
But yeah. Yeah, I think we storyline organically.
Yeah,
all of it.
Look, I mean, one of the things that is, sorry to leap it on the question,
Yeah,
but one
you
of the
good, it's
things
good.
that has kind of freaked and I think maybe impressed the Australians, is that we're not afraid to go, actually, hang on, we didn't storyline that right. Can we need to put, and I think we've done it now on both series, we went from like episode 3 to episode 4, and we might go back and go, be in the middle of writing episode 4 and go, no, actually, we need episode 3A.
Yeah.
So, and we've put in new episodes to tell the story in a more, and I mean that they're much more in a regimented system, and we feel we have the freedom to go, fuck it, let's put another episode in to bridge those
That's
two
right,
episodes.
because you realise things as you go along. That's what I mean. Both in writing scripts and in storylining, that you have realisations that don't happen on cue, if you like. You have epiphanies later. As James said.
Yeah, and what didn't work in the room that day, with time and a couple of drafts, you go, Max and I would sit down and go, I reckon, we need another episode there, and we'd go back and mess with the schedule and really do people's heads in.
And that's where my phone would go.
Yeah. And also, I don't know, as a writer too, there's the other thing for writers in the room. I always have this, have I died? So I've obviously said enough. I always have this thing where after I've delivered the first draft of a script, I have a whole lot of realisations, usually that night or the next night, about things that I would like to do, but it only seems to happen do you find this, James? You do, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Once I've delivered the damn thing, So there's that as well.
I'm in the middle of doing an episode at the moment that essentially I have ditched the first draft and am reinventing the story as I go. Not because it was bad, but because I think it can be better. And we have that, we use that freedom, and we use it sometimes right up to the nth degree, as much as we can.
Because you want it to be as good as it can be.
Well, I mean, I figure as showrunners, and that, to use that wanky American term, I mean, we have a duty to deliver to the production the script in the best possible form, and that's not only in a kind of an artistic sense, but also in a realistic sense in terms of what we know they can achieve within the shooting window, but still pushing them, because and I think they should be pushed, and art departments and that, and they will moan, but they love the challenge in the end. They may not love it at the time, but at the wrap party they tend to love it. So we will take all that time and more.
Other questions?
We've got the same flag. Why are Australians so different?
I went to a seminar thing. No, actually, it was some sort of sales and marketing wank many years ago. But this stuck with me. In New Zealand, we've got this whole thing about being at one with the land. Indoor-outdoor flow, and we're always out in the countryside and all the rest of it. In Australia, the land will kill them, and so and it's kind of true, because there's everything out there will kill you. And so they're much more combative and stuff. And these people from a sales kind of background, that was their theory on it. That was the difference in our personalities. And the reason we're just like, yeah, it's all good. And the Australians like, no, it's not all good. It might not be all good. And that was...
Actually, I'd say that one of the things that we're talking about the differences, yes, but one of the basic things about 800 Words was we wrote a series about people for people. It didn't really matter whether it's Australian or New Zealand. Those are the fringes, and that was also, and it was kind of comedy fodder for us. In the end, this is a story about a guy whose wife died, looking to restart his life with his family, dealing with grief, dealing with re-engaging in the world. That's a universal story, and the whole thing about write local, think international is totally true. Yeah. Just write the story that you want to write, and worry. All those cultural shit will, sort itself out somehow.
Yeah, but having said that, I think mine's died. There was definitely fun to be had, between exploring the similarities between us and the subtle differences, and that's definitely where a lot of the humour came from. And we were viewing New Zealand, I guess, through our fake, fresh Australian eyes, if you like, which was, it was an interesting thing to do.
Do you think the show might have worked in the UK, bearing in mind that they hate living in the country and want to come to they're very different from us?
Absolutely. Sea change, fantasy, isn't it?
Where would they move to? You could set it like a West End criminal family moves to the south of Spain. Oh no, sorry, that's Sexy Beast, isn't it? Yeah.
I'm having conversations with an English producer in the next month, because they're already talking about whether they could make a version. What would be really cool is if I could convince them that they should do the same thing and have an English person come here, and we could just make the same thing
here.
We
could
with
rotate cast out. Okay, Benson, Melina, you're out. No. bring in the English teens.
Yep.
Hey, look, England is full of gingers like Benson. No, I'm not going to tell that story, Maxine.
No, that's fine. No, that's right. Correct.
Yeah.
What story?
Any other questions? Yes.
I don't think it cut through as much. And I don't know, I actually don't know the answer to that. I was going to say all the New Zealanders I spoke to loved it, but that's probably not surprising. I feel like there was a large segment of the New Zealand population that didn't actually see it yet.
That's the thing.
But
and maybe TVNZ were right, and if we'd put a Broadchurch like murder in it, then it would have cut through.
Because Australian drama works incredibly well here, so... Nothing ever will. No, I'm serious, because the bar for success has changed so much. So that was what surprised them in Australia, is that this was doing numbers that they had gotten used to not getting. So success in Australia used to look like 1.52 million, and now it looks like 800,000 or 1 million. You know what I mean? The whole thing it's all come down. And in New Zealand, what constitutes a rating success is considerably different now to what it was 5 years ago, or when Pack to the Rafters was on.
Because one of the arguments that we would mount is that this is a kind of an old-fashioned show, and it got old-fashioned numbers. So, hello, maybe there's a formula that works.
Yeah, there is a fascinating thing there, which is that it isn't reinventing anything. This show, it is a very traditional kind of show, and it's got a lovely feel to it and all the rest of it, but we're not going out saying, and there's a on-demand part, and we've also done a web series which runs alongside the show where the teenage characters go off and get drunk, and sometimes they do, we're not trying to do any of that tricky stuff. We're making...
Yeah, that's called life.
That was behind the scenes.
Just going back to actually your question again, I just want to hark back to what you know what I was saying before about promotion. Yeah, you ask if something resonates. I'm starting to realise that sometimes how much something resonates is to do with how well it is marketed and promoted. I mean, obviously, if it's not a good idea and it's not a show that's well made with characters that you're going to come to love, it's never going to resonate, no matter how much money you throw at promoting it. But I'm starting to see that there's a bigger correlation between those two things, you know, than I previously thought. Yeah. So, yeah. Could it have resonated better? I would say yes.
Well, it will be interesting to see how it goes this time round. Yeah. No. Yeah. Although the investment from them was a good one, you know, compared to.
Cool. Something back end.
Settle.
It went to the production. It went to the production budget. But it was a good one. It wasn't, you know, they paid more for this than they would pay for a show out of America or England or whatever, on the basis that it was essentially local content for them. So, you know, they weren't trying to get away. Similar, not as much, but similar. Yeah.
I think there was a question over there.
Is that all an approach of Channel 7 with the promo? Does that mean there's essentially a whole lot of ready-made promotional assets that the network can take down off the shelf here, or do they need to build everything from the ground up?
No, they could, and New Zealand networks do that all the time, talk to Australians about their promotional stuff and get the, but they'd still have to make it work for the New Zealand audience. So they could. Sometimes you can pick up a promo from Australia and play it here and just revoice it, but Channel 7 wouldn't just give them that either. They would charge them for it because it cost them money to make it. Yeah.
I mean, the promo we looked at tonight said an Australian drama, so
Australian.
Presumably that would not have screened in New Zealand.
It was Australian.
That way.
Although,
Yes.
don't we still cringe when a Kiwi comedy, you know. Always ourselves. I mean, there's a bunch of people sitting in a room telling the stories of the lives of a bunch of characters. It's the same every show. You don't take into account external influences at all. It's all about what's happening in that room on that day.
What feels truthful, real to you, and what you like, what makes you laugh and cry. However, what I liked about 800 Words right from the start, and if I can't see who the audience is, I would question getting involved in something, you know. Like, to me, I could clearly see who the audience for this show was. And that then makes sense to me, you know. But it doesn't influence, they're not in my heads when I'm sitting around with James and everyone, you know, cracking up over our hilarious ideas. Yeah. Or not.
Any other questions? Yes.
If we're talking about sort of the future maybe of this kind of process, I mean, to some people it might feel like a one-off, or maybe just a one-off for now, but, and you also talked about, I mean, more previously, the restrictions of this kind of process. I mean, what kind of freedoms or what was more advantageous in a way in this process rather than domestic?
Making stuff that is not for New Zealand, making stuff with an international, you mean that process of making stuff. I think there's a huge, personally, this is my little rant, I think that there's a massive opportunity for New Zealand production at the moment, and New Zealanders creatively. I think that the world has never been smaller, and that the opportunities to talk to tell stories to different countries has never been greater. And I thought a lot about this with the Killing and that Danish and Scandinavian noir stuff. They they went out and they targeted, they went, what do we do well, like the television and the creative community in Scandinavia, what do we do well? We tell really dark, murderous kind of stories. Let's hone in on that. And they did that kind of strategically, and that's why the killings happened in the bridge and all the rest of it. And I think that there's an opportunity in New Zealand at the moment for us to find out what's the New Zealand voice, because there is one. It's just working out what it is that we've got to say to the world. And the world is ready to listen, which is a new thing. And not only are they ready to listen, but potentially we can get to them. And that's new as well.
Yeah.
So
Also, I mean,
it's so easy. Why aren't we doing
increasingly, success in one market gets so much more interest from
Yeah.
other markets. So, yeah.
And we can make television here that is just as good, if not better, than many, many markets. And I'm not even going to say cheaper, because that's not what it's about. We can capture a beautiful New Zealand voice and take it out. And I know that this is a session about 800 words, but with the Brokenwood Mysteries that we make for Prime, and again, that's not reinventing the wheel. That's a pretty solid kind of show. It knows exactly what it is, and it's not trying to be anything tricky or different to that. But it's sold ridiculously well internationally, and it's because it's we were very targeted in terms of what the story or the New Zealandness of it and how we were capturing that and how we were selling it. And I think that's something that we should all be thinking about when we're making stuff. If you make shows that are all set inside and in studios, you're not going to sell them internationally. That's the other thing about it. I think that 800 and Brokenwood both have that very much on location kind of feel, and that sells.
I mean, you guys were quite low-key and quite modest when we were talking about doors that might open, but it does seem inevitable that this success will open some doors for you guys or for New Zealand, or it can only be a positive thing, surely.
Yeah. I mean, let's face it, we've only got, how many? We've only got a few channels to make stuff for here. It does seem liberating, even if this doesn't happen again for a while, that door is open and you realise that, oh, hang on, there's a wider world out there that we can make stuff for and be thinking about, if it's the right idea. I also happen to think that, just on that subject, what we do well, one of the things I think we do really well here is drama comedy. I think I have theories about that, one of them being that it's because we're not really allowed to make comedies here. So we put them in our dramas, but I do think that is a genre, if you like, that we're good at here. That has an international appeal.
Any other questions? I have one last quick one, totally unrelated. There's a Russian version of Outrageous Fortune?
Of Almighty Johnson's.
Oh, there's a
I've got the DVD. You can come around and watch it. It's hilarious. It's really funny. I don't know. I don't think it ever got picked up, did it?
It's Ukrainian actually, and the Ukraine are also making some Step Dave, just quietly.
Thanks, everyone.